Technology is great when it works. So thank you for those of you that have Rock Kids back in Rock Kids this morning for being patient with us as we kind of had some issues with our computers and had to go back to a handwritten tag system. So appreciate the patience with that. But if you think about technology in reality, it's amazing how far we've come. I mean, many of us can remember like the dial-up internet, and I mean, think about the aspect of the power that we have in our pockets and we can have in our hands with our cell phones. When technology first started to develop, I mean, it took rooms and rooms full of computers to do what we can do, in a split second, and it's gotten smaller. And it's an amazing thing. And one of the things that we discovered at The Rock was there's a way that we could kind of incorporate some audience participation through like technology. And so what we did over the holiday season, you may not have realized that, we've installed scales in all of the chairs. And so what's going to happen as I preach, we thought, we want to come alongside of you. We want to help you with your New Year's resolutions. We want to help with accountability. And so there's going to be random pictures that show up on the screen with your faces, and underneath it will be what that scale reads, okay? And the minute I said that, some of you were like, okay, I'm going to shift closer to the person next to me. I'm going to share some of, the weight. And even though you knew that I was bluffing, you're like, there's no way they did that. In the back of your mind, you're like, would they do that? Some of you are like, honey, we're getting the kids, and forget the kids, we're just leaving. Forget the prayer, we're not waiting until he gets to pray. We're good, because I don't want anyone to know what might be on that scale, and it kind of gets us nervous inside. This morning, we're continuing our bucket list series. A quick refresher from last week, we were in Daniel chapter 5. And we're taking a look at 3 words that are written, and we'll kind of refresh your memory here in just a minute at what those 3 words are. But last week, we talked about time. And if you kind of remembered, we focused on this idea that our days are numbered. And because of that, oftentimes our attitude is affected by our expectations. What we expect in life, what we expect to happen, often has a direct influence on our attitude and the way we approach things. Kind of give you a little update on what I shared last week. I think I only had 2 Polar Pops this week, so I did pretty good. If some of you were wondering, what is he talking about? You need to go back, pick up the sermon, and it'll all make sense now. But not only is our attitude affected by our expectations, but because of our days are numbered, we need to be making the most of our days, and we need to be making our days count. And if you kind of remember, I said that these 3 sermons that we're going to be taking a look at last week, this week, and next week kind of begin to tie into one another. And so this week we're going to kind of focus on where we left off last week was this idea of how do we make sure that our days count? And how do we make sure that when we get to the end of the day, we're satisfied, we're happy with where we're at? If you want a spot to follow along, as always on the back of your bulletin, there's a spot there that you can take some notes. If you prefer the electronic version, you can open up the YouVersion Bible app under the events section, look for the Rock Church. And there you'll find all of the notes that we have, all the scripture that we're going to be using, as well as a couple devotional plans to kind of help you digest and kind of go deeper this next couple of weeks, next week. But before we go any further, let's stop and ask God to speak to us. Heavenly Father, this morning we thank you for who you are. And Father, we've had a chance to worship, and we've had a chance to focus on you and who you are. And Father, that's why we're here. It is about you. It's not about us. But Father, the amazing thing is when we begin to focus on you, you in turn have something for us. And so God, I pray that now we'll be able to catch that. That we'll be able to catch what it is that you have for us. That over these next few moments, we'll be able to set aside any of the distractions, any of the to-do lists, any of the things that are running through our minds, and we'll just be able to focus on who you are. And Father, what you want us to hear. And so God, I pray that just over these next few moments that we will hear your voice. And it's your name we pray. Amen. Kind of remember, Daniel chapter 5, King Belshazzar is having a feast. He's with his nobles. There's a war that is happening outside, and he brings out these goblets from the temple that were taken in Jerusalem, begins to mock God essentially by worshiping other gods as he and his nobles drank from these chalices. And in the midst of the party, there's a hand that shows up, and a hand that writes on the wall, which kind of, if you remember, if that would happen to you, would be something that I think would freak all of us out. But in Daniel chapter 5, verse 25, we get what was written. It's mentioned earlier in chapter 5, but we don't get exactly what is written. It's just that there's a hand that writes. But in Daniel chapter 5, verse 25, here's what we have. This is the inscription that was written, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. If you kind of remember last week, Mene, even though it's mentioned twice, means that your days are numbered. And if you kind of remember, the idea of King Belshazzar is told that his days are numbered, and in fact, his day or his number comes up that night as he is killed by an invading army. And it kind of just how his attitude was impacted by his expectations and how he lived his life. And it came to an end, and it's an incredible story. It's one that we looked at last week. This week, we're going to focus on that second word there. That second word is tekel, and it's everyone's favorite word, weighed. And let's face it, weight is everyone's favorite subject, isn't it? We all like to talk about it. It's something that people usually have no trouble finding, but they have a hard time getting rid of it. We've all had those instances where, we've talked about, or we've experienced weight gain, and we're like, what we don't like about it. We won't talk about how many weight loss programs there are out there. It's amazing. There's like the keto, there's the Play-Doh, there's the gluten-free, there's the all-meat diet, there's the intermittent fasting diet, which I'm like, isn't that what you do between meals? You just like intermittently fast, This time of the year, there are like, how many exercise commercials have you seen? And it's amazing. Now, we can like get a whole backstory on 30 seconds of an ad. I mean, all you have to do is ask Peloton what 30 seconds of an ad for their bike it sparked this incredible debate of what this fictional married couple was experiencing. And there are some people that swear by the diets. There are some people that swear about the diets, okay? We all have those stories. And isn't it great? And we all know this, but like they show these great examples of weight loss. And at the bottom, there's that little, it's usually in really, really tiny small print, results not typical. It's like this person lost 50 pounds in a month, and like typical is like 1 pound every 2 months or whatever. We hear those and we're like, okay, I am waiting for the Mountain Dew diet, all right? Mountain Dew slushy diet, that's the one that I'm like, okay, I'll jump on board. I'm ready for that. That's the one because I like my carbs. I like my fried stuff. That's just who I am. But for this morning, I'm going to ask you just for a moment, set aside the New Year's resolutions that you may or may not be keeping, okay? When it comes to your weight loss or when it comes to your diet or how you want to eat or those type of things, set that aside for a moment. And regardless of how scary it may be, to step on the scale for a moment. Because the message to Belshazzar in Daniel chapter 5 was that your days have not only have they been numbered, but your life and your days have been weighed. And Daniel comes to Belshazzar and says, Belshazzar, you're going to have to give an account for the way that you've lived your life. Your days are being weighed. And I think the message that Daniel speaks to Belshazzar, and as we begin to explore that, I think that God has something that he wants to speak to us about. And being weighed is something physically that we've gotten used to. We understand what it means. I mean, think about it for a moment. When a baby is first born, what are the things that we're wondering about? We're wondering, well, was the baby healthy? We're wondering if it was a boy or a girl. We're wondering or what its name was. We're wondering how long it is, and what else? We're wondering how much did the baby weigh? I mean, so a few seconds out of the womb, and people are already wondering, how much does the baby weigh? Think about when you go to the doctor. What is the first thing that happens when you go to the doctor and they bring you behind, the curtain or the door? You've been in the waiting room. You may have gone because you stubbed your toe and you think you broke it. And what's the first thing they make you do? They make you get up on the scale. And they weigh you. And you're like, it doesn't matter what I weigh. It's my toe that hurts. But they want to know. And and the nurse is like writing it down. And some of you younger ones, you won't remember this because they have the electronic scales. But do you kind of remember the old time before the electronics? They had like the scale with the two big weights on it, and they had to like move it. And like they started it at one point. You're like, oh, please move it to the right because I don't, because you never wanted them to guess, wrong. But we're used to it. Whether or not we all have scales in our house. I won't ask you how many of you use it on a regular basis, But I'm sure in our house, at some point, we have a bathroom scale because it's something that we have. It's something that just, it comes with the house, doesn't it? You have a scale and so where do we go from here? The first thing we need to realize, when it comes to this idea of being weighed, when it comes to this idea of not only Belshazzar, but our life, and what does it mean for our life, we have to realize that scales give us a starting point. Scales give us a starting point. And there's two kind of scales that I think we're often tempted to use when it comes to this, or when it comes to life in general. The first one is the balance scale. We've all seen them. We may have used them in school. It's the, for some of you that maybe what's that like? It's the scales of justice, that type of thing. You got something that hinges, and you got two platforms, and you try to get things to balance. And here's how way a lot of people live life. A lot of people live life with the balance scale thinking as long as the good outweighs the bad, then I'm okay. As long as the good in my life, the things that I do, I helped the old lady across the street. I didn't get mad when the person with 20 items got into the 15 item or less checkout lane. I've kept my temper under control. I've done the good things. As long as the good outweighs the bad, then we're okay. And we live life like that. As long as, the scales are tipped in my favor, then I'm okay. The problem is it's not reality. We may want to live like that, and there may be people in life that try to live like that, but the reality of the situation is it's not the way it works. Regardless of how much good we have on the one side, it is never enough to overcome the bad that we do on the other side. Regardless of how insignificant or menial we think the bad may be when compared to other things. We can look at the news, and there's a lot of bad things that are happening. There's a lot of bad people out there. And so often we can get into the comparison game. Well, I'm not as bad as so-and-so, so I don't need to do as much good because, it's just, I've just lied a little bit. I've disobeyed my parents. There's not a whole lot to overcome. But we need to understand that when we try to play that game, we come to the same realization that King Belshazzar was found. Daniel comes to him and says, Belshazzar, your life has been weighed, and not only has it been weighed, but you have been found lacking. You see, for us, if we would just take that balance scale approach, and we would say, I'm going to line up the good versus the bad, no matter the outcome, we're going to be found lacking. It's why we need a Savior. It's why we needed Jesus to come and die for us, because there was no amount of good that we could do to tip the scales in our favor. There was no amount of good that we could do, no amount of Bible reading we could do, no amount of prayer that we could do, no amount of giving to the church, the things that we think make us a good Christian. And again, don't hear me say you shouldn't do those things. But there's nothing that we could do to tip the scales in our favor. It is nothing but what Jesus did for us. And through the cross, that we're able to be set free, that we are able to tip the scales in our favor because of what Jesus does. Because Jesus puts his hand on the scale and says, I don't care what's on the other side, I'm all that you need. And so maybe if you're here this morning and you've not heard that and you're trying to live life tipping the scales in your favor, maybe that's why you needed to hear this morning of, there's nothing I can do, I just needed to depend upon Jesus. And if you're here this morning and you're trying that, I hope you will hear that. The other type of scale, you got the balance scale, then you've got the bathroom scale. And this is the one that strikes fear into the hearts of people. And when do we step on it? We step on it the first thing in the morning. The thing that we dread the most, we're like, well, I might as well get it out of the way first thing in the morning. And I understand, I know why we step on it in the morning, because we haven't eaten anything yet. And we're like, maybe overnight I magically lost weight just by sleeping. And we're hoping that happens, and we step on the scale, and sometimes it determines the rest of our day. If you like the number, it gives you a good day. If you don't like the number, you're like, I'm having a bad day. You go binge eat at breakfast because you didn't like the number it gives. And the moment you step on it, it gives you a number. And here's the thing: no matter how hard you try, you can't change that number. You can hold your breath. You can clench every muscle in your body. You can stand up as straight as you can, and that number is not going to change. You can even lift like one leg off the ground. And I don't have both feet on the scale. No matter what you do, that scale is going to give you the same number every time you step on it. You could get on and off again 3 or 4 times in the morning, and you might lose a little bit through the exercise, but it's going to give you the same number. And that's what you need to understand. That's where you're currently at. And that's the thing about the scale. You step up on the scale, and it's going to tell you where you are currently at. It's going to give you the starting point. And here's the thing. The moment we decide to do something about our weight, we're talking physically here for just a moment, we need to step on the scale to realize where we're at. Because after that, it will determine where we are going. Are we headed in the right direction? I could say, well, before stepping on the scale, well, here's what I think that I weigh, and so, I'm going to go this route, and so I want to lose 5 pounds. Well, the problem is, if I think I weigh 165, but I actually weigh 170, and I get up on the scale and it says, 171, I'm going to think to myself, well, I've gained, 6 pounds. When in reality, I've only gained 1. Or we don't know how much we've lost. If I gain I think I weigh 165, but I weigh 170, and I step on the scale and it says 168, I could go, man, I gained 3 pounds, when in reality, I'd lost. And so the moment we decide to do something about our weight, we need to step on that scale to find out where we are at, to find the starting point. And so the first time, it gives us that baseline. For our lives, we need to do the same thing. For our lives, we need to step up, and again, don't use the balance scale analogy because we're all found lacking. But when it comes to who we want to be, when it comes to our bucket list, when it comes to those things that not only do we want to do, but we want to be by the time that our time on earth is done and our number comes up, we need to find that starting point. That point that we can gauge, okay, am I making progress? Am I making progress in who I want to be and what I want to do and those things? And so as scary as it may be, the first thing that we need to do is take an honest look at who we are and to say, you know what, if I want to make wise use of my time, those things that I want to do, I need an honest realization where I'm at. And that's exactly what the scale will do. The scale will give us a starting point. But not only will the scale give us a starting point, the scale will also show us where we have lost. And that's the one thing we all love about scales. We love it when that scale shows that we've lost. And this is the point most of the times of when we step on the scale. We want it to show a loss. We want to see where we've lost weight. We want the number to be lower than it was the day before. And it's why we step on it in the morning. Because we hope that, okay, I haven't eaten 3 meals. I haven't, done all this, and so I'm going to step on it because it will give me that lower number. And we want that, and we crave that, and that's why we do what we do. And let's be honest here for a moment. We all probably could stand to lose a little bit. And I'm not talking about weight. Look at what the writer of Hebrews writes. Writer of Hebrews writes in Hebrews chapter 12, 1 and 2. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. And I love the picture. I think it's Paul that's writing this just because of some of the analogy that he uses. We're not exactly sure. But the writer of Hebrews writes this idea and draws this picture of a runner running a race. And as he runs the race, he runs with as little as possible. I mean, think about this for a moment. I'm not sure exactly when the Summer Olympics are. I don't think they're this year. I think they're in a couple years. But when you get to like the 100-meter dash and, all of these things, you never see the runners coming out in like a snowsuit. They're never running in, they've got like a whole bunch, a big jogging suit on. What are they running in? They're running in as little as possible. And they're running in stuff that is aerodynamic so that they can run as fast as they can. And we would laugh if, someone came out and decided to run the 100-meter dash in a snowsuit, in snow boots. We'd be like, that is the silliest thing. You're not going to go very far. And that's the analogy that Paul, or the writer of Hebrews, begins to use here. This idea of we're in a race, and so we need to run to win. And because of that, we need to kind of get rid of some of the extra stuff, the things that we need to lose. And he gives 2 categories here. I'm going to focus on the latter one first. And the category that he says we need to lose is this idea of we need to lose sin. So that when we step on the scale, there has to be some loss where we see when it comes to the category of sin. And when it comes to the issue of sin, here's the trap that is very easy for us to fall into. We have this head knowledge that we know we're not supposed to sin. Okay? We understand that. It's not a question of whether or not we should. We understand that we shouldn't sin. After all, it's what's gotten us into the mess that we're in. Again, going back to the balance scales, we understand that sin is the problem. Genesis 1, it was perfect. Adam and Eve sinned. Here we are. We're in a messed up world with stuff that happens, and sin is the result of that. And the only hope for that is Christ. And the only hope for that is the blood that was shed on the cross and coming into a personal relationship with him. And when we have that, we get his grace, which forgives us. And all of those things that happen, and we love that, we understand that. And so we come to God and we ask him to forgive us from our sins, to cleanse us. And because of that, we know that we're forgiven. We know that when we come to God and ask for forgiveness, that we are forgiven. But if we're not careful, it can be a dangerous thing as well, this idea of grace. Because look at what Paul writes in Romans chapter 6, verses 1 and 2. What shall we say then? Shall we go on sinning so that grace may increase? By no means. We are those who have died to sin. How can we live in it any longer? And so grace sort of becomes this double-edged sword. Grace is the thing that is there, that when we sin, it's there to forgive us. And we know that God will forgive us if we ask for it. But it also becomes that kind of catch-all, because we're like, well, I know I can sin because I've got grace. I know I can have a little bit of sin in my life because I've got that grace. And so when I sin, I know I can go to God and God will forgive me. And so these little things in my life, it's okay because I've got grace. And it sort of becomes this double-edged sword. And hear me out and say this. I do not believe that we will be totally without sin until we get to heaven. I don't think that's the way it works. I don't think anyone in life is ever perfect, that we are without sin completely. But we sort of take that, like, well, as long as there's no biggies in my life, as long as there's no, I'm not breaking the 10 Commandments, I'm not doing anything that's going to wind me up on the news and then, wind me up in the paper, you know what, I'm going to be okay with a little bit of sin in my life. But the reality of it is what the writer of Hebrews writes here is that even a little sin begins to hinder us in our race. Even those things that we let hang around and we never really do anything about, it begins to hinder us in our race. And Paul here, the writer, I keep saying Paul, understand it, I'm not sure who it is. The writer of Hebrews begins to say, you know what? We need to get rid of that. The problem is, I think for a lot of people, we come to Christ and we never see a loss in the sin aspect of it. And again, I'm not going to debate or doubt someone's salvation and the validity of it. But I do know that when we come to Christ, as we live life and as we progress in our relationship with Christ, we should be seeing loss in this area. We should, when we step up on the scales and we first come to Christ, you say, okay, God, this is who I am. God, you have wiped me clean. God, I am forgiven. And God says, you are forgiven and you are clean. But you know what? You've got 200 pounds of sin in your life right now that we need to start to deal with. And if, a year or two down the road, you step up on the scale and say, God, where I'm at with my sin, God's like, you know what, we still got 200 pounds of sin in your life. God's like, there's a problem there. You should be seeing a loss in that area. As you step up on that scale, there should be less today than there was the day before. And there should be less, yesterday than there was the day before that. But so often, for us, the starting point is the same day after day, because here's the thing. We step on the scale in the morning. We go, here's where I am. We live our day. We say, God, I got grace. At the end of the night, I'm going to pray that God forgives me of all my sins, and I believe he does. But we never see any loss. We never see any change. And so that's the first area. I think the first area that we need to see loss in, and the scales need to show loss in, is this area of sin. And then you've got the second area that the writer mentions here. And this is an interesting area. Because notice what the writer says here. Because not only does the writer say we need to throw off sin, but notice he says we need to throw off everything that hinders and the sin. So what the writer is saying is there are some things that may not be sin, but are holding us back. There are things that in and of themselves may not find, a reason for us to go to God and asking God for forgiveness, but there are things that are holding us back. And let me give you two examples of what they may be here. The first one is this: fear. There's a lot to be afraid of nowadays, isn't there? I mean, go to this past week and, turn on the news and you had everything from the world is going to end to, Well, you talk to a lot of people and like, this is the end of the world. World War III is going to start because of what happened. And it struck a lot of fear in the hearts of people. One of the most repeated commands that God gives in Scriptures is this issue of do not fear. In fact, it's mentioned over 70 times to either an individual or a group. And it's this idea that we're not to fear. That there's nothing in this life to be afraid of. That there's nothing in this life that as we look at, we should be afraid of. Now, we can be concerned about things, and being concerned and being fearful, I think, are two different things. But there's nothing that we need to be afraid of. Listen to what Johnny Erickson Tada said about fear. She said this: fear manipulates you with the mysterious to taunt you with the unknown. Fear of death, fear of failure, fear of God, fear of tomorrow. His arsenal is vast. His goal, to create cowardly, joyless souls. He doesn't want you to make the journey to the mountain. He figures if he can rattle you enough, you will take your eyes off the peaks and settle for a dull existence in the flatland. And I think that's a good example of what fear does to us. The fact of the matter is there is evil in this world. It flows out of what we just talked about, this idea of sin. And sometimes we can look at it and go, man, it is easier said than done to not be afraid because there is a lot to fear out here. But what the enemy comes is the enemy uses fear to manipulate us. Because if you're afraid of failing, you may not try. If you're afraid of tomorrow, then you're just going to have anxiety and worry and stress, and it is going to weigh you down. And what she talks about here, it's going to sap the joy from our life. And when there is no joy, it is hard to run. When there is no joy in our life, it is hard to get up and to make the journey that we know we need to make because we are afraid. And a lot of things we are afraid of, it just saps us. And so I think that's one thing that we need to look at. We need to say, you know what, I need to begin to get rid of this. Not that necessarily that fear is a sin, because even though God says do not fear, I don't think he ever comes to the realization that it's sin. But he's saying it's something you don't need in your life. The other thing, another category that this might fit into is this idea of worry. None of that we have fear, and it kind of goes hand in hand with worry, but man, we can worry about a lot of stuff, can't we? And so often when we let worry and fear take control, we get tunnel vision. We get tunnel vision, and all we can see is the one thing that we're worried about. The one thing that we're concerned about. The one thing that is causing us anxiety. The one thing that is this. And we get tunnel vision, and we focus on that. And in the moment we get tunnel vision, we're sunk sometimes. You know, God talks about this, and Jesus talks about it several times in Scripture about this idea of don't be anxious about anything. You know, don't worry about tomorrow. Don't worry about what you will eat or what you will drink. Tomorrow has enough worries of its own. You know, find that in the Sermon on the Mount. But Jesus comes and he says, you know what, you don't need to worry about things. Worry, you know, let that to me. Come to me and cast your cares on me, and I'll care for you. Leave your burdens at the cross, and I'll come and I'll take care of them. And so often what happens is we never see loss in these areas. We get up day after day and we're fearful, we're worried, we're anxious, we're stressed, we're all of these things. And again, I'm not saying that those things aren't going to come at moments. And I'm not saying we're going to snap our fingers and it's all going to be over and we're never going to have that again. But it's these areas that we should be seeing some loss in. We shouldn't be as fearful today as we were yesterday. We shouldn't be as worried today as we were yesterday. Why? Because of who God is. And he comes to us and says, you know what, I want you to see some loss in those areas. I want you to come to the point that, you know what, you're not as anxious, you're not as stressed because you're giving those to me and you're running the race. And maybe for you, it's not fear, it's not worry. Maybe there's something else in that category that falls under the hindrances. That it's not necessarily a sin, but it's something that is holding you back. And so maybe if you're taking notes, you just may want to just write that. Is there something that is hindering me? Is there something that I have in my life that I'm holding on to that is stopping me from running the way that I should run? And be open and honest with God. Allow God to speak to you in that and allow God to show you those things that it might be. Because it's those things that hold us back. And it's those things that we need to see some loss in. We need to be able to step on the scale, and when it comes to our life, God's like, I'm weighing you, and man, there's some things you just need to lose. But there's the other side of the scale too. Because so often we get focused on that. Well, the scale is supposed to show me where I lose. The scale is supposed to show me those areas of my life where I have lost. But the other thing a scale shows is a scale shows us where we have gained, and usually this is not a good thing. We want the loss. We never really want to step on a scale and it show us that we've gained weight. We never want that usually. Now, maybe when we're younger and, we're high school and maybe if we're trying to bulk up for the football team or, those things. And, there's a certain point that when a baby grows, we want the scale to show gain. But eventually we want that to stop, in our minds. We're like, okay, once I get out of high school and college, how many of us, when we went to college and we heard about, the freshman 15, and, they walk in and it's like, you're going to gain 15 pounds as a freshman. You're like, well, why is that? Because you have a cafeteria. And now you no longer have to depend upon mom and dad to cook you food or have food because there's an endless supply. And it's amazing. Like, you go to college, and a lot of people, they put on 15 pounds. They're like, we don't like that. When we definitely get out of college, we don't want to step on the scale, and we don't want it to show any gain. Why? Because we stopped growing height-wise. We want the two to kind of go together, don't we? As long as we're growing height-wise, it's okay for that scale to grow. The minute we tap out, like height-wise, we're like, okay, I can stop growing because we now know there's only one way to grow. We're now no longer growing up, we're growing out, okay? And we don't like that. And so we don't want the scale to show gain. But I think when it comes to our life, that's exactly what we need to do sometimes. We need to have the scale show some weight gain in our life. We need to see growth. And it takes the form of discipleship. And going back to the starting point on our scale, I think there are two questions that we might want to begin to ask ourselves if we're gaining weight. Two questions that when we step up on that scale and we see where we're at, two questions that we ask ourselves to say, okay, am I making the progress that I should be? And the first one is this: how have I grown as a disciple? And here's the thing, I'm not talking about like, end of the year, we're getting up and we're like, okay, new year, let me look back at 2020 or 2019. How did I grow as a disciple? We try to look at the whole year. Okay, that's not what I'm talking about. But I'm talking about every day. At the end of the day, kind of the thing that you're not supposed to do, but step up on the scale and go, okay, where am I at as a disciple? How have I grown today as a disciple? How have I grown today as a follower of Christ? Have I spent time in the Word? Have I spent time in prayer? Have I spent time in worship? Have I spent time serving someone else? Have I spent time, just seeking God? Have I spent time, and fill in the blank. You don't have to have all of those things every day. But if you're coming up and you're going, well, today I didn't do anything. Today, I didn't grow as a disciple at all. I didn't spend time in the Word. I didn't spend time praying. I didn't spend time doing any of the things that I knew. Maybe it's an indication, okay, today you didn't gain any weight. And again, I don't think it's this case of if we go a day and we don't gain any weight, God looks at us and goes, how bad that you are. But are there things that I did to facilitate that growth? Questions that might help us know, are we headed in the right direction? Because here's the thing, and you've heard the thing, a pound of muscle weighs more than a pound of fat. Well, it's a pound of either one. But it's the density of it. It's the ability to do what you need to do. And oftentimes, here's the amazing thing. You may actually, when you step on the scale and you're working out, you may actually gain weight, but it's proportioned differently. And it's in different areas, and you're able to do more. And I think sometimes when it comes to life, we don't ask this question enough of, how am I growing as a disciple? And not just, okay, I got the pastor preached, and I walk out, okay, did I grow? And if I didn't, well, then that's his fault, because he didn't give me what I needed to grow, and, I didn't get to do the a la carte. This is like Monday through Sunday. Having an honest conversation with ourselves every day. How did I grow? How did I grow as a disciple? Then the second question is this, and it kind of goes along with the first, but not how have I grown as a disciple, how have I helped others grow as a disciple? One of the things that you will discover when you read Scripture is that we are to make disciples. The Great Commission, our bucket list, the thing that God tells for us is to make disciples. It is what we're to be about. And so the question becomes is if we're going to fulfill our purpose, if we're going to get to the point that we can cross this off the list when all is said and done and we can accomplish what we want to accomplish in life, what are the things that we are doing that will bring others closer to Christ, that have helped them grow as a disciple? And as we grow, we are better equipped to help others grow. And so you cannot have one of these without the other. You cannot be yourself growing as a disciple and then not be equipped to help others grow. But the conversely is you cannot help others grow as a disciple if you are not growing as a disciple. And so what happens is when you see these things and you begin to ask yourself these questions and you step up on that scale, when these things are happening, there's going to be, that needle is going to move to what we often think is the dreaded right, because that's higher. And I don't necessarily want that, but God goes, no, that's what you want. As a disciple, you want to grow. You want to have things that you didn't have yesterday. You want to add things that you could get into that you didn't have yesterday. And here's the thing. Don't get caught in the factor of loss versus weight. And, well, I need to lose more than I gain. Don't start comparing these things. And I know sometimes for the scale, you may want to have two different numbers. Hey, here's the areas that I need to lose. Here's the areas that I need to gain. And I need to make sure that I'm doing both of those things. Because I think that's what happens when it comes to the spiritual walk and our spiritual life. Last week, we ended with this idea that we're to make wise use of our time. And one of the ways that we do that is by weighing ourselves and asking ourselves every day, how am I growing as a disciple of Christ? How am I helping others grow as a disciple? And we begin taking an honest look at our life, and an honest evaluation, and understanding there's grace. Understanding that we may not see the gain every day like other days, but ask ourselves, am I facilitating those things? So this morning, if you haven't stepped up on the scale yet, what's stopping you from getting that starting point? What's stopping you from getting to that point where you say, you know what, I want to find out where I'm at. And God, just show me where I'm at. God, where are the areas that I need to lose? God, where are the areas that I need to gain? And as scary as it may be physically, and as much as we try to avoid it physically, spiritually, we need to be stepping up off that scale. I'm going, okay, God, show me. Show me where I need to lose. Show me where I need to gain. And then, God, help me to do the things that will cause me to lose and will cause me to gain. So those are the questions I want to leave you with this morning. What's holding you back from running the race that God has designed you to run? How are you seeing gain? How are you seeing loss? Which is all going to culminate next week when we take a look at that final word. Because it's going to tie this all in together. Okay, how do I do this? I want to make the most use of my time because my days are numbered. I want to make sure that when I am weighed, I am not found lacking when it comes to my life, because 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 10 talks about that we are all going to be judged, and not just judged in a way of heaven or hell, but judged what did we do with the time. And I want my life to mean something. I want my life to have some weight to it. So how do I do that? That's what we're going to end next week with. And so I invite you back next week. But this week, don't be afraid to step up on the scale. Look for those numbers where you need to lose. Look for those numbers where you need to gain. Heavenly Father, this morning we thank you for who you are. And God, for Belshazzar and the tragedy that is his life and the mess that his life is. But Father, the lesson that it can teach us. And so God, because our days are numbered and we only have so much here on earth, God, may our life be full. May when we get to the end and our days are weighed, Father, when it comes to salvation, we depend upon you. But Father, when it comes to how we live our life, may we not be found lacking. And God, this morning for the areas of our life where we need to lose, those areas of our life where there are things that we're holding on to, there are things that are hindering us from running the race that you've intended, God, help us to lose them. God, help us when we step on that scale to see the loss. And Father, for those areas that we need to gain, those things that we need to be a better disciple, a better follower of you, God, may you show us. May you help us facilitate growth. to do the things that we need to do to gain the weight that you want us to gain so that we can be better disciples for you and our life can have an impact on the world around us. So, Father, this morning, I pray that you help us. Father, help us to step up on that scale, to get an honest look at where we're at. And then, Father, may we live a full life, a weighted life, a life that matters for you. And we ask all this in your name. Amen. Will you stand as we close in worship this morning?